I would like to welcome everyone to today's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission briefing on the human rights situation in Bangladesh. My name is Tariq Ahmed. I'm a foreign law specialist at the Law Library of Congress, focusing on South Asia. Today, I will be moderating the briefing titled Human Rights in Bangladesh, an update. I'm joined today with an esteemed group of human rights advocates and experts on Bangladesh, which will help us examine the current political and human rights situation in the country. The World Bank has described Bangladesh as an inspiring story of growth and development. According to the bank, it has reduced poverty in record time and achieved lower middle income status within 4 decades. Despite its economic success, experts have raised concerns about the increasing concentration of power under the governing Awami League party led by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, who has been in power for 14 years. International and domestic human rights organizations, along with experts, have highlighted the deteriorating human rights situation and democratic backsliding in the country over the past decade. They have documented cases of extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, curtailment of judicial independence, restrictions on freedom of speech and press, including persecution of journalists and bloggers, and limitations on internet freedom. The use of the 2008 Digital Security Act to arrest and prosecute journalists, social media users, and bloggers has been of particular concern. Some of these problems and issues have sadly is also faced by other countries in the area as well, in the region. Though there have been some significant improvements in the reduction of extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances since the imposition of US Treasury Department sanctions on Bangladesh's elite paramilitary force, the Rapid Action Battalion, with national elections fast approaching in January 2024, there has been an increase of political violence and arrests against the opposition. As noted by the UN, in recent months, recurring violence has erupted at a number of opposition rallies where police have used rubber bullets, tear gas, and water cannons. Also, there are significant concerns about the current government's ability to hold free and fair elections. Previous elections in 2014 and 2018 were marred by allegations of vote rigging, ballot stuffing, intimidation, and violence against opposition political parties. The Bangladesh National Party has been protesting and calling for the resignation of the Prime Minister and the appointment of a caretaker government before the elections. Today, we have a distinguished panel of experts who will brief us on these and other important issues and latest developments. They will each read out their remarks and we'll hopefully have some time for questions at the end. If you please use the chat Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to include your questions. I'm going to now briefly go over the bios of our distinguished panelists. Mohammad Ashraf Zaman is a Bangladeshi human rights defender who advocates for the rights of survivors of torture and victims of extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearance, and seeks stronger legal protections in compliance with international law in this area. He has authored many reports and publications on Bangladesh and the South Asian region on issues such as institutional dysfunction in justice systems and the importance of democratized states having a competent rule of law system. Christy Ueda is the Donald M. and Susan N. Wilson Fellow in the International Advocacy and Litigation Team at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. She works on civic space issues and human rights violations in countries in Africa and Asia. Prior to joining RFK Human Rights, she has been a staff attorney with Legal Aid Foundation of the Los Angeles Right to Counsel work group and a fellow in the Human Rights Watch Africa division. Julia Bleckner is a senior Asia researcher at Human Rights Watch. She holds a PhD in political science from Yale University, where she's focused on political violence in Bangladesh. Beginning as a Fulbright researcher in Bangladesh in 2011, she has documented and analyzed politics and human rights in Bangladesh for over a decade. Jeffrey McDonald is a visiting expert in South Asia program at the United States Institute of Peace, USIP, and a senior advisor for the Asia Pacific Division at the International Republican Institute. He is also a non-resident associate at Harvard University's Asia Center. Dr. McDonald's academic research focuses on political and extremist violence, democratic design, conflict management, and comparative politics with a regional focus on Bangladesh, South Asia. Mr. Ashraf, if you can begin, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tariq Ahmed. I also thank the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission of the United States Congress for this opportunity. Since the briefing on enforced disappearances in Bangladesh that this commission hosted in August 2021, the human rights situation of that country has remained extremely alarming as before. The designation of sanctions against the Rapid Action Battalion and 6 of its top commanders by the Department of Treasury of the United States and the subsequent visa ban on the 2 former RAB commanders has created significant impacts. Hundreds of victims of gross human rights abuses and their families, as well as the human rights defenders, welcomed the designation. As an immediate impact of the sanctions, extrajudicial killings halted for around 3 months. Under the Sheikh Hasina regime, between January 2009 and June 2023, there have been 2,683 people extrajudicially killed by the law enforcement agencies. When we look at the statistics, we see that the agencies committed 107 extrajudicial executions in 2021, and in 2022, after the designation of sanction against the RAB, the total number of extrajudicial killings were 31. From January to June 2023, 8 people have been extrajudicially killed, including 3 crossfires, 4 tortured to death, and 1 shot to death by the police. It indicates that the number of extrajudicial executions in the pretext of crossfire, encounter, and gun battle have been reduced. The above statistics suggest that sanctions have been instrumental to save many lives as far as extrajudicial executions are concerned. The victims who have been shot to death in the post-sanction period are mostly the opposition activists, while the people opened gunshots, police opened the gunshots at peaceful political rallies. The trend of committing enforced disappearances remains almost steady since the sanction was designated. According to the documented cases, 659 people have been disappeared between January 2009 and June 2023. In 2021, there were 23 people disappeared by the law enforcement agencies, while in 2022, 21 people have been the victims of disappearances. From January to June this year, the documentation suggests 16 people have been disappeared. The incumbent government, we need to see that they have established the following patterns. Number 1, empowering the law enforcement agencies who are recruited on political consideration with massive arbitrary power. 2, deliberate and disproportionate use of forces, disregarding the basic principles of the use of force and firearms by law enforcement officials. 3, highly repressive and heavy-handed use of the law enforcement agencies against opposition's peaceful political events, and ruling party-friendly attitudes of the statutory institutions of the state. 4, using the complaint mechanisms of the registering trumped-up, often fictitious criminal cases against the opposition political activists. Number 5, systemic denial of access to justice for the gross human rights violations through police judiciary nexus, targeting the dissidents and the opposition leaders. 6, intensified hounding of the families of enforced disappearance victims to coerce signatures on pre-drafted statements by the intelligence units and law enforcement agencies. Number 7, physical and digital surveillance on the independent human rights defenders, academic scholars, journalists, and dissidents who consistently face intimidation, torture, ill treatment by the state actors and the pro-government non-state actors. Prolonged arbitrary incarceration of dissidents in trumped-up cases registered under draconian laws by the law enforcement agencies and the pro-ruling party entities. Reprisal against independent human rights defenders. Number 10, rewarding the key perpetrators of gross human rights violations, including those who were sanctioned by the Department of Treasury of the United States. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations and the independent experts of the UN have repeatedly expressed their serious concerns over human rights situation of Bangladesh. Recommendations were made to amend the draconian laws. The Sheikh Hasina government not only disregards those calls for respecting human rights, the regime smears hate campaigns against the international community, including the United States and the United Nations. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina slammed the US government for announcing a new visa policy for Bangladesh in compliance with the latter's commitment to promote democracy in the country. The government keeps up the pattern of abusing the laws and the institutions of the state for retaining power through ballot stuffing, like what it did in previous night of the December 30 in 2018 national election. Valid concerns of international community over targeted violence on contestants of elections is retaliated with repeated attacking rhetoric against the diplomats. While the national parliamentary elections are ensuing and the strive for the people's right to vote is growing higher, the government of Bangladesh is making things hard for holding a credible, free, fair, and inclusive elections that can guarantee a fair play for all parties. The government has speeded up the pace of prosecution against the targeted opposition leaders, aiming to bar the potential candidates from contesting elections. Tens of thousands of people are taking to the streets to demand their right to vote under a neutral interim caretaker government, despite mass arrests, judicial harassments, physical attacks by the police and the ruling party people. The government has adopted the Representation of People Amendment Bill 2023 to make the Election Commission a toothless tiger by scrapping the authority of the already dysfunctional body. The newly adopted RPO amendment authorizes the Election Commission to postpone or cancel the results of voting of one or more than one polling stations in any number of constituencies on polling day, and takes away the power of canceling results of the entire election to a constituency. In the era of systematically rigged elections under Sheikh Hasina, such amendments to the RPO have irreparable damaging impacts to the process of democratization in Bangladesh. These changes are deliberately made as there is no judicial remedy available under a completely subjugated judiciary, while the judges don't face sanctions for their complicity in gross human rights violations and denial of access to justice. We would urge the Lantos Human Rights Commission of the United States Congress to utilize its full mandate to minimize the human costs that the Bangladeshis have been paying under an authoritarian kleptocrat in office without an institutionalized system of accountability for gross violations. Ensuring the people's right to franchise is an immediate and unavoidable prerequisite for democracy. Accountability and democratization must not be part of any bargain process costing the lives and liberties of the people. I thank you. I would welcome questions.
Ms. Hueda?
Thank you very much. As seen in the lead up to the last election in 2018, the government of Bangladesh has continued its efforts to close civic space ahead of the January 2024 election through its targeting of civil society organizations, human rights defenders, journalists, and others considered critical of the government. These individuals and their families have been subjected to retaliatory arrests, harassment, and intimidation by state officials who have enjoyed impunity for their misconduct. Freedom of expression and free press continue to erode in Bangladesh. Already in the first half of 2023, prominent Bangladeshi human rights organization Odakar has documented 151 attacks on journalists. In addition to individually targeting journalists, the government has attacked media outlets, ordering the closure of 191 websites it accused of publishing anti-state news in January 2023, and forcing the main political opposition party's newspaper to halt operations in February 2023 after canceling its printing license on tenuous grounds. The government's attempts to stifle critical voices have become increasingly brazen, with the Prime Minister criticizing the nation's daily newspaper, calling it an enemy to her party, the Awami League, an enemy of democracy, and an enemy of the country's people, after the newspaper published a report on high food prices. The report's author and the newspaper's editor were charged for allegedly undermining the country's independence. The government also continues to target and discredit Nobel laureate Professor Muhammad Yunus and his anti-poverty work, with the Prime Minister stating that he should be plunged into a river to teach him a lesson, and the recent indictment of him and other Grameen Telecom board members by the Anti-Corruption Commission to tarnish his internationally recognized poverty alleviation work. In addition, the government of Bangladesh has severely curtailed the rights to freedom of association and peaceful assembly. The treatment of Odekar is emblematic of the ongoing targeting of human rights defenders and organizations for doing their important work. Since 1994, Odekar has been a leader in monitoring and reporting on human rights violations in Bangladesh, such as arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, and torture. Odekar's leaders, Mr. Ajalar Rahman Khan and Mr. ASM Nasiruddin Elan, continue to be prosecuted and to face judicial harassment in a 10-year-long case based on the government's trumped-up allegations that they had published fake, distorted, and defamatory material just for cooperating with the United Nations, publishing a fact-finding report on extrajudicial killings, and reporting on excessive use of force to disperse a protest in Bangladesh in 2013. In addition to targeting its leaders, the government of Bangladesh has interfered with Odekar's operations by leaving its application for registration renewal pending since 2014. After almost 8 years of inaction, in early February 2022, just months after the United States designated sanctions on the Rapid Action Battalion and its leaders, the government sent Odekar a letter requesting the name and addresses of everyone killed extrajudicially and disappeared between 2009 and 2021. Then, in June 2022, the government deregistered Odekar as an organization, stating that the organization had published misleading information on extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances in Bangladesh that had, according to them, seriously tarnished the image of the state to the world and created various issues for the country. However, it is the Bangladeshi government's failure to investigate and hold perpetrators accountable for human rights violations, rather than Odekar's reporting of these violations, that has tarnished the country's reputation. International civil society organizations, including Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, where I work, as well as the organizations of my esteemed co-panelists, have continued to publicly condemn the dire human rights situation in Bangladesh, but have been met with denial and deflection from Bangladeshi authorities. When the United Nations human rights experts have written letters expressing their concerns over the harassment and smear campaigns against Odekar, the government responded by accusing Odekar leader Mr. Khan of playing victim by fabricating a story involving law enforcement and intelligence agencies and expressing their disappointment at the repetitive nature of the allegations. Other human rights organizations that have similarly and courageously reported on such abuses by the government have also been retaliated against. The Bangladeshi government's insistence on silencing those who speak out instead of acknowledging and addressing the human rights violations they have exposed has become routine. When discussing the U.S. sanctions on the Rapid Action Battalion and its officials in March 2023, the Prime Minister herself assured the battalion not to worry about the imposed sanctions and that the government will identify those who tarnish and defame Bangladesh and uncover their motivations. The following month, her security advisor accused international organizations of working with insiders to disband the battalion as part of a conspiracy. Bangladeshi civil society welcomed the U.S. sanctions and called for further sanctions to urge their government to implement much-needed reforms on security forces and to stop the violations. We believe that until impartial and effective accountability measures are adopted by the government of Bangladesh to investigate and address such violations, the United States must not lift the existing sanctions and must consider additional sanctions against other security forces, such as the Detective Branch and Directorate General of Forces Intelligence, that partake in similar violations throughout Bangladesh. The United States must emphasize to Bangladesh that should they want to address the human rights violations underlying the sanction designations, then going after those who are documenting and exposing these violations instead of holding perpetrators accountable does nothing positive for their human rights record. The United States must stress that an open civic space is necessary for a functioning democracy, especially in the lead up to the January 2024 election. Bangladesh must ensure an enabling environment for journalists, human rights defenders, and organizations to conduct their important work without fear of harassment, intimidation, and reprisals. Thank you very much for your attention. I remain at your disposal for any questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bluckner.
Thank you first to the Lantos Commission for organizing this panel and to my esteemed colleagues for their comments. I am here speaking on behalf of Human Rights Watch. First, we would like to underscore the significant impact that the United States has had on protecting rights in an effort to ensure space for democratic participation in Bangladesh. Following human rights sanctions by the Department of Treasury, there was an immediate drop in extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances. Instead, we saw people still being picked up and held in unlawful detention for a period of time, but then being released or produced in court. Although we continue to hear concerning accounts of torture in custody, the drop in enforced disappearances and killings directly following the sanctions clearly demonstrated that Bangladesh authorities could bring an end to the abuses whenever they choose. The US government also decided not to invite Bangladesh to the Summit for Democracy and announced in May of this year that it will restrict visas for any Bangladeshis undermining the democratic process. These decisions have put the Bangladesh government on notice that its international partners are paying close attention and may have the effect of deterring individual members of the security forces from participating in repression and violence. However, as we get closer to the election, we are witnessing a rise in violence and security force abuses. We urge Congress not to trust claims by the Bangladesh authorities that they are committed to holding free elections. While the State Minister for Foreign Affairs claimed during a recent media briefing that Bangladesh has renewed its commitment to hold free and fair elections, security forces simultaneously unleashed autocratic and abusive attacks that clearly contradict those claims. Just a few days after the state minister made these commitments, Bangladesh police indiscriminately fired rubber bullets, tear gas, and water cannons and beat opposition party supporters with batons during protests. In the lead up to these demonstrations, authorities arrested over 800 members of opposition Bangladesh Nationalist Party in what appears to be a systematic effort to target and detain political opponents. Authorities also filed cases against over 1,500 named leaders and activists of the opposition and over 15,000 unnamed people. This use of criminal complaints against large numbers of unknown people is a common abusive practice in Bangladesh, allowing the police to intimidate and threaten virtually anyone with arrest. In previous months, law enforcement officers have used these open cases as warrants to raid the homes of political opposition members. According to the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, over 4 million cases were filed against their leaders, activists, and supporters and its associate bodies between January 2009 and June 2023. In many cases, the arrest charges appear baseless. In fact, similar to what we saw ahead of the 2018 election, some of the accused were either dead, abroad, or hospitalized at the time of their alleged offense. For example, on July 18, ahead of the recent protests, police filed a case against 109 BNP leaders and activists and 500 unnamed people, accusing them of vandalizing a college campus. However, 2 of the accused, Shafiqul Suman and Abdul Haldar, had died months ago. These cases are so common in Bangladesh that they're colloquially described as ghost cases. The practice reveals the true intention of the arrests, to decimate the opposition. Indeed, the recent mass arrests appear to reflect leaked minutes from a police meeting held in early July that outlined orders to systematically arrest and convict opposition members so that they would be disqualified from participating in the national election. In the leaked minutes, a senior police officer admitted that There's a lot of pressure on the government from outside regarding the elections, and instructed the police to ensure convictions of members of the opposition because if, quote, they are punished through trial, no one will be able to raise questions about them internationally. The minutes include 10 steps to ensure convictions of opposition members. Soon after, BNP leader Tariq Zia was convicted for corruption and disqualified from contesting. Opposition groups have also alleged that they are frequently attacked by ruling Awami League supporters who seem to enjoy police protection. While there may be violence on both sides, members of the ruling party are rarely held accountable. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina plays a role in inciting such violence. For example, during a rally in December, she told her party leaders and activists that, quote, the hands that would be raised against us have to be broken. The next day, Awami League members, backed by security forces, violently assaulted opposition gatherings. International observers should view the recent brutal crackdown and systematic arrests of the political opposition as a clear indication that elections in Bangladesh will not be free. The United States has been an invaluable partner in pressing the Bangladesh government to stop election-related abuses. We urge Congress to take the following 3 actions as the election fast approaches. First, as the largest financial contributor to UN peacekeeping operations, Congress should press the UN Department of Peace Operations to publicly commit to an enhanced human rights screening of Bangladesh peacekeepers at all levels. Ensuring that human rights abusers are screened out of participation in UN missions is a clear way to ensure that the UN is implementing effective policies and procedures to prevent human rights violations as is required by appropriations legislation. Second, the new version of the Digital Security Act has been announced. Since its enactment in 2018, the DSA has been used by authorities to silence dissent. It has even been used to arrest children for voicing criticism of the Prime Minister on Facebook. The new version of the DSA, the Cybersecurity Act, is an effort to appease international partners. The US and others should hold the Bangladesh government to its promises and ensure that these reforms do not mean a new law is simply the DSA by another name. Congress should also press the government to drop charges against all people arbitrarily accused under the DSA, as well as the previous Information Communication Technology Act. This includes dropping charges against prominent rights activists like Adila Rahman Khan and Nasruddin Elan of Odikar, photojournalist Shahidul Alam, well-known journalist Rosina Islam, and others. Finally, in the run-up to the elections, members of Congress should continue to publicly raise concerns regarding the absence of conditions for a free and fair election. The abuses that we've documented over the last several months already undermine the democratic process, and the Bangladesh government should understand that US policymakers are keeping a close eye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. McDonald.
Great. Good morning to those in DC and good evening. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. It's a pleasure to be here. First, I'd like to note that today is the National Day of Mourning in Bangladesh, commemorating the assassination of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, Bangladesh's founding father. So along with all Bangladeshis, we acknowledge the extraordinary contribution and sacrifice that he made to the founding of Bangladesh. I was asked here today to discuss the state of political rights in Bangladesh and the preparations made for free, fair, and non-violent elections, with the parliamentary elections due by January of 2023. A credible election requires not only transparency on election day, but also fairness throughout the pre-election period. To this end, I'd like to focus my remarks on the current state of the electoral environment and citizen engagement. First, on the electoral environment. By objective measures, the political environment in Bangladesh has improved to some degree over the past year, with opposition parties having more space to carry out activities. The primary opposition party, the BNP, and other opposition parties have held large rallies criticizing the government. Independent and opposition candidates have won local level elections, indicating a degree of electoral fairness. The ruling Awami League has consistently said it intends to hold a free and fair parliamentary election, and it has called for international observers to monitor polls this winter, demonstrating a willingness to subject the electoral process to credible international scrutiny. These indicators deserve acknowledgement. However, aspects of the electoral environment need more progress, and I'd like to focus in on 3 of those. First, political violence remains high. Competing political rallies often devolve into violence. Opposition demonstrations have at times faced violent police crackdowns. There have been incidents in which opposition candidates are attacked, apparently without intervention from nearby police. Within parties, rival factions engage in violence. And so it is vital that members and supporters of all parties avoid violence and that Bangladesh's security services protect all sides. Second, the actions of Bangladesh's election commission often lack clarity. For example, the recent decision of the election commission to grant registration to relatively unknown parties while denying registration to established and active parties appears arbitrary. While every country is entitled to develop its own criteria for political party registration and other election regulations, these criteria should be applied transparently and equally to ensure trust in the process. Third, the legal system appears inconsistently applied. Media sources report that thousands of opposition party members and activists currently face legal cases on a variety of charges, while Bangladesh's judiciary can and should apply the law to all citizens, including members of the opposition when appropriate. It is imperative to avoid the reality or appearance of bias. The second topic I'd like to discuss is citizen engagement. For a democracy to thrive and elections to be free and fair, citizens need to feel free to support or criticize any politician or party and to advocate for their policy preferences. As was noted earlier, the reform of the Digital Security Act has been rightly welcomed by the US government, international watchdogs, and other domestic actors. This reform signifies the Bangladesh government's willingness to acknowledge criticism and make reforms. Still, the government should continue to seek input from domestic stakeholders about this new law and ensure that digital freedom is maintained in the buildup to the election. More broadly, it is far too common for Bangladeshis to express fear of challenging those in power. Citizens should always feel confident to express their political opinions online or in person. I'll conclude with 3 recommendations for Congress regarding political rights in Bangladesh. First, the United States should continue to publicly advocate for and utilize policy tools in pursuit of free and fair elections. The United States has matched its calls for credible elections with tangible actions, such as the visa restriction policy. These statements and actions are appropriate. Critically, though, to ensure their credibility and effectiveness, is important that American statements and actions are applied equally to all political actors, regardless of party affiliation. Second, the United States should consider international election observation. International election observation missions can deter violence and electoral fraud. Effective observation requires substantial resources, time, and personnel to coordinate, as well as minimum conditions of electoral transparency and participation. If such conditions exist in Bangladesh, the United States and other international actors should consider observing the polls. Third, the United States should continue and expand nonpartisan democracy assistance to democratic stakeholders. Credible elections require not only fair processes, but also democratic actors that are informed, equipped, and empowered to participate. Democracy assistance programs train election candidates, inspire citizens to participate, and foster data-driven advocacy. These core components of Bangladesh's democracy must be nourished and sustained alongside strengthened institutions to ensure free and fair elections. In sum, progress has been made toward credible, free, fair elections in Bangladesh, but with approximately 5 months left before the next parliamentary contest, more work is needed to ensure an environment in which parties and citizens of all creeds and ideologies trust the political process. The United States should continue to stand with democratic actors in Bangladesh, but ultimately, Bangladesh's democracy is in the hands of its citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your remarks. Now it's time to take questions, and I'll start. A lot of you have noted that due to international pressure, there have been indications of some progress when it comes to improvement of the human rights situation in terms of enforced disappearances and in terms of extrajudicial killings. Have these been met with also structural or legal changes? That any indication that there may have been more meaningful change in terms of, or is this mostly due to political expediency of the current government? Do you see any indication of progress when it comes to accountability of past violations of human rights? Would anyone like to take that question? Okay. Julia, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I can just speak briefly to that, and others may want to weigh in as well. I mean, I think it's notable that, yes, we saw a drop in extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances immediately following the sanctions. But then a few months later, they've continued again. And I think that is an indication that there has not been the structural reform that's needed. I can give the example of enforced disappearances. So Bangladesh has acceded to all of the core human rights conventions, except for the Convention on Enforced Disappearances. And despite, consistent and well-documented evidence of enforced disappearances over the last decade, the government authorities continue to deny that they happen at all. And not only that, but promoting farcical claims that those who have been forcibly disappeared, when there is credible evidence that they were picked up by security forces, that those who have been forcibly disappeared actually are just in hiding because they're embarrassed about something that happened with their family, or they're hiding from a criminal offense. So until the Bangladesh government one acknowledges that enforced disappearances, for example, are indeed actually happening in the country, and even accedes to the convention that would recognize that enforced disappearances are a real thing, then they're not going to have any true accountability for those who are committing them.
Thank you so much. One other question that I had was, one of the key demands of the opposition political parties is the establishment of a caretaker system, which Bangladesh once had. In terms of this debate over whether to have a caretaker system or whether to have the Electoral Commission take a central role in monitoring elections, in terms of free and fair elections, maybe Dr. McDonald, if you can speak to this a little bit more, in terms of having free and fair elections, what is the current status of this debate, and what are the indications of which system would be preferable in terms of establishing this kind of a positive electoral environment?
Sure. I think, well, as you know, I think there's in some ways the core debate right now is on the caretaker system. The BNP is currently boycotting elections until the resignation of Sheikh Hasina and the return of some system similar to the caretaker system. The Awami League is saying is refusing at this moment. I think for the United States Congress, from the perspective of outside actors, I think it's inappropriate for us to say whether a caretaker system is needed or not. In the end, in principle, the Election Commission has the powers to oversee a free and fair election. In practice, right, the opposition doesn't trust the Election Commission, and many Bangladeshis don't trust the Election Commission. So I would say if Bangladesh moves forward with holding an election under the Election Commission, more work needs to be done to build faith, to build trust that this Election Commission can oversee free and fair elections. Again, it has within its power, in my view, the ability to do it. It just needs to demonstrate a willingness to do it to the opposition.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Mr. Ashraf Zaman, if you'd like to take that as well.
Thank you very much. Regarding the election and holding credible election in the given context, we need to also understand how the recruitment of the Election Commission has taken place in Bangladesh. So the people who have been recruited as the election commissioner or chief election commissioner, and the public interventions they have made, the actions, the records they have set by hosting local government elections, by-elections in the country since they have started their mandate as the election commissioners, that has earned their reputation for themselves, that they cannot be trustworthy at all. I can cite an example. In Barishal city, one of the southern metropolitan cities of the country, the city corporation election, one of the mayoral candidate was, brutally beaten to bleed on the election day. And then when the complaint was raised to the election commissioner, chief election commissioner, his remark was that he has not died. That's what the chief election commissioner said. So somebody who is a candidate in the election, he was attacked and then vote was of course, rigged in favor of the ruling party candidates. And then the chief election commissioner's remark was, he has not died in that attack. So that kind of entity has already lost the credibility because of their action and because of the recruitment process. So you need basically a reboot of these institutions. And without institutions, you cannot just hold things or make things acceptable to the people. And latest indication of the Dhaka in the diplomatic enclave, the by-election held last month on 17th of July, the way the contestants of an independent candidate has been attacked. I mean, even police allowed the attackers to do that, unleash that violence on him. So that, and the election commission did not play any role to protect or to take care of this situation. So in this context, it simply cannot happen under the incumbent government, of course, because that simply does not have any intent to let the people vote. In Bangladesh, the people who are allowed to vote who have passed away, or either they're the ruling party affiliates. Otherwise, nobody is allowed to vote. And there are documented, evidence there. BBC recorded, in the 2018 election, recorded video footage that overnight ballot boxes are stuffed. So, the Bangladeshi realities are unlike the other jurisdictions where the incumbent government can hold elections. And that's why, if we are concerned about people's right to vote, there has to be a credible system. And the caretaker system has been proven. And interestingly, that was Sheikh Hasina's demand. She made Bangladesh unstable, and hundreds of days of protest across the country in terms of general strikes for the caretaker government. And after assuming power, she doesn't want to lose it during her lifetime. That is the bigger problem in that country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's take some questions from the Q&A. There's one question about disproportionate usage of brute police forces in Bangladesh, one of the largest hospitals where imprisoned religious leader died. It appears that his family and followers were looking forward to organize a funeral prayer, which police denied and used brute force. Similar violations of rights to hold funerals have been denied by Bangladesh law enforcement bodies. What human rights bodies can do in a concerted effort so that grieving families of political dissidents can hold funerals peacefully? I don't know if anyone wants to take that.
If I may, it just happened yesterday. And this is not new in the case of Bangladesh. The man who has been died, he was convicted by the Sheikh Hasina government, called it International Crimes Tribunal. And that tribunal has earned, a different kind of reputation where the entire judicial process failed to ensure the right to fair trial of the defendants. So people in Bangladesh, they wanted the justice for all the crimes that were committed in 1971 during the war with Pakistan, war of independence with Pakistan. But the government basically used this trial process as a political vendetta. That has been very well known. So this person, whether he was truly an offender of any of those crimes, it could have been known well if the system was credible, if all the prerequisites of right to fair trial were guaranteed, and then we could have trusted that the judgment that he got. But the incident happened is that the defense witness from the court premises got abducted by the law enforcement agencies, and then he remained disappeared for months, and he reappeared in an Indian prison in West Bengal. state of West Bengal in India. And that happens to be a Hindu gentleman. And the man who was convicted and who died yesterday is an Islamic scholar. I mean, he's very prominent. So in the context that the government, by setting the example of abusing this judicial institution, particularly for the International Crimes Tribunal, government has paved the way for this long-lasting criticism about the process. And now, if I come to the particularly funeral part, this has been a reality in Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina government, that people have lost. If you belong to any of the dissidents or the opposition, then your right to funeral, your many other rights, socialization, many things are not recognized, and it cannot be guaranteed at all. So this is not the, a new case. It is one of many cases where the opposition people don't enjoy their right to have a proper funeral the way they want. And the similar rights for the pro-ruling party people are all guaranteed. They can go and whichever way they wish. So this is a valid question, and I thank the questioner, the participant, for asking the question.
Here's a question. There's been a lot of discussion about abuses by the RAB, but can you please elaborate on the allegations of abuses against the detective branch and the Directorate General of the Forces of Intelligence? If anyone would like to get into.
Sure, I can just begin briefly.
Yeah.
So the detective branch and the DGFI, they have committed the same violations that the RAB was sanctioned for by the US. And so there have been immense amounts of documentation by different human rights organizations and different human rights defenders that they are also taking part in arbitrary detention, torture, extrajudicial killings, and enforced disappearances. And they actually work in tandem with the RAB as well. And so these are all part of the same security forces. I saw that one of the comments mentioned the DW documentary that came out a few months ago, where it was revealed that a lot of the orders came from higher up, and we are finding that that is true. Not only do the orders come and go down to the RAB to be fully implemented and operationalized, but they are also given to intelligence branches of the different security forces, including the detective branch and the DGFI. And I'll allow my colleague to elaborate if he would like, Simon.
Yes, exactly. These detective branch of police has committed in recent years more enforced disappearances than the Rapid Action Battalion, according to the statistics that we have. So, and the DGFI is involved, and there is, as Christy also mentioned, there is a coordinated action by all these agencies, that certain agencies, they track, they provide the information, and then it goes to the executing, agencies, and then they do it. So it's like they complement each other, they collaborate with each other to commit the crime. And this has been documented by the human rights groups, and also, the DW and Netra News together. This is a serious concern, and they enjoy blanket impunity in the given context of Bangladesh.
Here's another question about, we've talked a little bit about the application of the 2018 Digital Security Act and the suppression of dissent. One question is about, what is the current situation of faced by secular Bangladeshi bloggers currently?
I could briefly touch on this. As mentioned in my opening remarks, the state of free press, as well as freedom of expression, which includes the work of bloggers and other online media personalities, their rights have been severely curtailed. Even bloggers who are out of the country and exiled have been targeted by the government. And so it's because they are online, I guess the physical distance has not stopped the Bangladeshi government from going after them. We have seen also too that the government has gone after the family members of these exiled bloggers and journalists and reporters. The family members who are still in Bangladesh are receiving or facing the reprisals. And for instance, a few months ago, a very famous journalist's brother was actually unfortunately beaten in Bangladesh shortly after he had published a pretty damning report on the human rights condition in Bangladesh. And so unfortunately, yeah, that space is being restricted as well.
We haven't really talked a little bit about, in terms of the current situation, in terms of religious freedom in the country. In the most recent report of human rights practices in Bangladesh, the State Department noted widespread communal violence against Hindu, Christian, and Buddhist religious minorities in the country. Can anyone comment on this issue and whether communal violence will play a role in the upcoming elections?
Start us off on this question. I think it is certainly important to note that there has been a history of election violence targeting minorities, and particularly Hindus, who are traditionally kind of supportive of the more secular oriented parties. I think the secular Islamist kind of divide in Bangladesh is a bit more complicated today than it might have been in the past in terms of how it maps on to the main political parties. But when you look at post 2001, post 2014, right, we saw violence targeting Hindus kind of carried out by mostly Islamist parties and their allies. Kind of more recently, you've seen an uptick of this type of violence, the Durga Puja violence in 2021, which was sparked by fake Facebook posts and rumors, right, that pushed this violence. So I think with Bangladeshis increasingly online, and election kind of related competition and discussion kind of online is growing. I think there is good reason to be kind of concerned that as tension grows around this election, particularly in the post-election environment, that minorities could in fact be more vulnerable to violence in a kind of a post-election environment at the community level.
I can just briefly add to that.
No worries, no worries, yeah.
Yeah, I think my colleague made a very good point that, that we have seen this uptick in violence. I would also add that an element to that is the role of abusive legislation like the Digital Security Act. So we've seen this the vague and overly broad draconian language of the Digital Security Act that includes clauses like, hurting religious sentiments that could, if somebody posts something online that hurts, quote unquote, somebody else's religious sentiments, they can be charged with the Digital Security Act and put into prison. And so we've seen an increase over the last few years since the Digital Security Act was passed in 2018. We've seen an uptick of people using these very overly broad and vague clauses like hurting religious sentiments to target people that they find offensive speaking out online, but also to target members of the opposition. And so there was this recent announcement that the Digital Security Act was being revised. And I agree with my colleague who noted that does indicate that the government, is able to take feedback and is making those revisions. However, I am concerned that from what we've seen of the draft of the revised law, it's the revisions aren't changing these sort of overly broad terms that are used in an abusive way. So the changes, as far as it seems, it looks like they're mostly changes to making offenses that were, non-bailable, bailable, rather than, for instance, changing these sort of this problematic language that is used in abusive ways.
Thank you so much. One question that we have is, how can elections be free and fair if the main opposition leader is under house arrest? What can the US government do to help the situation?
I mean, that's a great question. And I would also question how this election can be free and fair when, you know, hundreds of other opposition members are being arrested. I think in terms of what the US government can do, I mean, that is, you know, increasingly raising these concerns with the Bangladesh government and laying out that, you know, the US government isn't just paying attention to whether the election was free and fair on election day, but rather looking at the conditions in which the election is taking place, which is right now. And that the question is whether you can really have a free election if by the time the election happens, most of the opposition is detained.
Another interesting question is that about though Bangladesh does not enjoy GSP facility in the US, some of their allies do, like the EU. So should the US do anything in terms of working with their allies to impose other types of international pressure on the government? Other forms of economic pressure?
Julia, you want to answer?
Sorry, could you repeat that question? Sorry, Tariq.
Yeah, 1 second. Let me actually go to the actual question.
All right.
Yeah, it is about Bangladesh does not enjoy GSP facility in the US. Some of the allies of the US provide the country with that, particularly the EU. One of the access to GSP is to respect the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Shouldn't the US encourage their allies to utilize these economic levers to ensure fair elections in Bangladesh?
I mean, absolutely, yes. That's something that we've been doing as well. Yeah, I mean, Bangladesh is the #1 recipient of EU trade preferences, and is looking to graduate from the least developed country status in the next couple of years, which would then, in order to continue to access some of those trade preferences, would require the Bangladesh government to adhere to an additional level of human rights commitments. And so it's a very, very powerful tool. And I would welcome the US government in encouraging our colleagues in the EU to use those tools to the best of their ability.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. I have another question about what should members of Congress do to encourage the Bangladeshi government to constructively address ongoing rights violations and impunity, and to take necessary steps so elections meet international standards? Anyone?
Could you please repeat that question?
Yeah, no worries. What should members of Congress do to encourage the Bangladeshi government to constructively address ongoing rights violations and impunity, and to take steps necessary so that elections meet international standards?
Like in the past, the bipartisan Senate Foreign Relations Committee, they intervened. I mean, they wrote letters. So there are many things. I mean, when we understand how the United States legislative bodies work and what sort of mandates they have. So Congress has, I mean, quite a vast mandate to, I mean, focus on democratization, and they can do their job the way the precedences that we have in front of us.
Anyone else would like to address this question and maybe more broadly what else can the US government do in terms of?
Yeah, I mean, I can just, as I said in my opening comments, the US government has actually been a really, really powerful partner in protecting the democratic space in Bangladesh. and using a number of like very effective tools to demonstrate the US's attention to human rights concerns in Bangladesh. I would say, sort of to repeat what I said earlier, that the US can continue to make very clear that that free and fair elections don't just happen on election day, and that what we're seeing over the last couple of months of like a huge ramping up in arrests and targeting of the opposition, that those conditions are undermining a free election. And so pressing the government to allow participation and to stop arresting the opposition and to allow activists to freely and safely document human rights abuses and to stop targeting civil society, and to recognize that all of those abuses contribute to making the conditions and making it impossible for a free election.
I can just add, I think, and really more to reiterate what I said in the opening statement, I think there's a process question, and then there's a kind of democratic fundamentals question, right? And so you have American statements, right, and actions from Congress that are addressing the process, right, continue to play the role as a kind of standard bearer for global democracy, which I think is important. This consideration of election observation, again, is something to think about the process. But again, as I noted in the opening statement, the idea of the kind of raw material of democracy, the citizens, right, civic education, the quality of the candidates, the quality of advocacy can all be assisted, right, through democracy assistance funding, right? So I think it is important to look both at the process of elections, but also ensure that we're trying to strengthen the kind of raw material of democracy in Bangladesh, so that they can kind of take advantage of a more credible process if and when it occurs.
Thank you so much. We have one more question. I don't know if we have a minute just to answer it. What is being done for the security of religious and ethnic minority citizens of Bangladesh, particularly with regard to gender-based violence and mass rape?
Very brief answer is that for giving people redress regardless of the crime, all you need is competent institutions, the criminal justice institutions. And that institutions with competence don't exist in Bangladesh. So be it the issue of gender-based violence, or any other kind of or a majority minority, I don't want to go to that discourse, because everybody is a citizen. So when the government only cares about the protection of the ruling party and its affiliates and does not care about the rest, then you cannot expect anyone else facing discrimination or any sort of abuses or crime at the individual level or collectively. You cannot expect that. And there have been many evidence that even the ruling party people raped women for voting an opposition candidate and gang raped, and there has been no justice for that. So there are many evidences for that. So first we need to focus is that what the intention of the government of the day, and whether it regards or it cares about the citizens, and it has intent to allow the institutions grow with the strength and independence, with professionalism. So if that is in place, then gradually things may improve. It may not be happening overnight, but gradually it can improve. But it has degenerated very much in the given circumstances.
Thank you so much. This brings our briefing to an end. I want to thank all the panelists for shedding such light and insight on the current human rights situation in Bangladesh. And I would like to also thank all the viewership in terms of their questions, insightful questions on the current situation in Bangladesh. Thank you all. Take care.